We're so lucky to have the curator of photography at the LA County Museum with us, Lakma. And I want to thank our mutual friend, Lance Fung, for singing her praises to me a year ago. He said, Brian, you've got to meet Eve. So I finally had a chance to meet her in Houston, Texas, earlier this year when we were reviewing portfolios at Houston Photo Fest, and we became fast friends. And I'm glad your husband's not around to hear this, but we just laughed our way through Houston in dimly lit tour buses by night. You know, the city really puts on quite an extravaganza for the Houston Photo Fest. And I just instantly knew she was a great person, and we're lucky to have her bring her good eye and her experience to jury the show that you're going to see in a minute. Eve has worked on numerous exhibitions in her 15 or more years at Lakma, ranging from topics on Cuban photography, multimedia work by artist William S. Burroughs, an ongoing self-portraiture series, pictorialism, and the still and moving imagery by California-based Katie Grannon and Charlie White. I adore Katie Grannon. Unreal. Recent exhibitions that Eve has curated, she contributed to the catalogs. One of the favorite shows I've seen, I want to really brag about you, but she put together a killer show that maybe some of you saw up in San Jose. It debuted at the San Jose Museum of Art, but Eve curated a show called This Is Not a Selfie, and that was so accurate. But the show included people like Diane Arbus, Robert Mapplethorpe, Cindy Sherman, Alfred Stieglitz, Cartier-Bresson, Robert Frank, Andy Warhol. It was like the history of photography, and it was all, the whole show was pictures that those people had taken of themselves before the term selfie even was coined. So it was, you know, a stunningly contemporary show, and yet it was such a treat to stand in front of a Robert Frank, a Cindy Sherman, you know, on and on. Excellent. Eve curates exhibitions highlighting the LA County Museum of Art's permanent collection, and she's going to show us a great overview tonight. I think I'll stop bragging about you and just say, you know, after Eve's great presentation, come on up to the gallery, have a glass of wine and food, and then we'll gather together and the Madam Juror will reveal all. Please join me in welcoming.
So should I be using this microphone, or am I projecting?
Yes.
Is this on? Yes?
No, I think so. Let's see. Good question.
You were projected. Very well. I could do that too, but better?
No.
Hello.
There we go.
There we go. I know. I can start to get involved in my notes here, and I am going to use notes, but I'll be speaking extemporaneously as well. I'm just famous for my tangents, so hopefully I will not go off of them so we can get to that reception in time. So thank you to Brian for the invitation, and to Rick for the hand-holding through the process, the maze, as I think I called it at one point. Had a wonderful...
The gauntlet.
The gauntlet, yeah. We had a wonderful amount of submissions this year, and I was really happy to sort of see what was happening. I also want to thank you all for coming. And by way of introduction to the show, I thought it would be useful for you to see and experience my world of photography, that is within the LA County Museum of Art, which is an encyclopedic museum. So I know that many jurors in the past have been in photocentric institutions. I am not, so I will try and show you that world and broaden your horizons in that way. So of course, curators and titles. I'll get to the story about This Is Not a Selfie title, but curators and titles, you know, we love to have a colon. And of course, I very enthusiastically am trying to talk about the present and the future, but of course I'm going to start with the past. All you have to do, try. Do I need to point at something?
Point it over here.
So, the present and the future. So I'm immediately going to the past, just to give you some context. I'm going to let you look at this trio of Japanese-American pictorialists while I give you a little background on the LA County Museum of Art. First off, we started collecting photography long before there was an official department. That's a bit unusual. Most museums in the States started their photography departments late, but that also meant they were collecting late. We were not. We had wonderful people like, I'm going to name drop, Edward Weston in our backyard, who helped put together the salons, pictorial salons of photography that landed, were on view at LACMA. We acquired work directly out of those salons. These are some examples. And I use that reference to Weston just to give you the context that our collection was really driven by a different voice, a less academic voice, more of an experimental node. You'll see that that's my through line through the talk tonight. Because obviously Weston was versed in photography, and he was encouraging people who might not have been submitting to other salons to submit to our salon. And we therefore were the beneficiaries because we would acquire things directly out of the show. So the first image you're looking at, Hideo Onishi, was created in 1924. We acquired in 1925. Next image is Hiromi Kira, created in 1927. We accessioned it in 28. And Kei Shimajima, made in 1928 and purchased in 28. So a good example of our forward thinking. This is a strength in our collection. I should also point out, as I mentioned to the docents earlier, my background is in Far Eastern art. So you're going to see a little through line there that I'm appreciative of. It's also to say that I focused on photography eventually, but I am constantly aware of that entire through line that is art history. Often photography is siloed and has its own history, its own display area, and those are very discrete. The summation of my presentation, I could say it in one sentence, is to show that that history is intertwined, obviously. At LACMA, our curatorial departments are created for purposes that are really understood outside of the internal structure. They may be by region, by time period, by region and time period. For example, our Japanese department doesn't collect photography that's created by Japanese makers, nor does it go forward in time past a certain point. It's restricted. My department is restricted by media, but I can do the entire globe. So you'll see my presentations that are global going forward. And also going forward is our new building. So I'm giving you a little sneak peek. I haven't seen these images large, so I hope they're readable. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with our campus right now. It is a campus, so multiple buildings that are going to be reduced down to what you're seeing is one building that literally crosses the street. It's Wilshire Boulevard, if you're familiar with our territory. But it'll be one floor. So right now, we have several buildings, and they're all 3 and 4 stories high. And what happens is the Western art is privileged, so non-Western art sort of goes to the top, where you barely get visitors coming. Ancient arts also rise to the top, and so the here and now is privileged. And the fact of the matter is, we're an encyclopedic museum, we have a story to tell that is much larger than that. This new building will allow that to happen, ideally. Let me show you one more interior shot. That's sort of its shape for an aerial view. So also not very hierarchical. It's an amoeboid shape. You can enter at any point. And what I'm getting to is the fact that photography right now is something that I deploy throughout the museum. And in this new manifestation, it will be even more so. So we'll be in all the nooks and crannies, we'll have special exhibition space, but also all the departments will be doing that. So, a little more even keel there. So this 21st century museum idea is not uniquely ours. It's something that a lot of museums are going through. A lot of museums are also thinking about disbanding certain departments, right? Why is photography by itself? There's photography in American art. Our Art of the Middle East department, for example, has mostly an ancient collection, but has decided to collect in the here and now and focus on photography and video. So really, photography could be anywhere. And so the internal structure is starting to change, and therefore I think we will be one of many museums that you will visit that will seem different in that way. And you'll be able to sort of create your own narrative as you go through. It's not so much a led experience. That's the sort of term 21st century museum. So, as Brian mentioned, I have been doing all this all along, sort of clawing my way to getting photography further into the timeline throughout the museum. Once we have our new building, presumably it's a piece of cake. So what I'm going to do is show you a few examples of exhibitions that I've curated that I've actively chosen to not have them be in a photo silo. I'll describe where they've been on view in the museum so you can understand how I'm trying to bridge that gap. This is an Edward Steichen show that I curated, Talk of the Town. Edward Steichen, who is one of our founding fathers of photography, sort of created the whole field of fashion photography and celebrity photography. Much as we might all groan about that. When he was depicting celebrities, they actually had done something to become a celebrity. And I'm mixing in, that's Giacometti, an artist to the second to the right. The last image is Charles Schillo. And so at that time, artists were also very much celebrities. This was sort of a tongue-in-cheek presentation I did that had, this is a mini version, a wall of gents with a female figure centered and given much more prominence, along with a female wall with a center male figure, and the final wall was couples. Steichen did an amazing amount of early commercial work for Kodak, and interestingly, he spun the tale of photography being something you did together as a couple. There you go. So that was the last. That's Charlie Chaplin looking very somber in the center. Mae West, very far end. But I chose to put this show in a space in the American art galleries, and you walked through our arts and crafts area, which is something we have great strength in, and then you landed into this modern world. And those two things were happening at the same time. It was the arts and crafts movement was a return to an appreciation of the handcrafted versus the mechanized world we were becoming. And photography was part of that mechanized world, creating the modern world. And so to have this imagery be seen after that had so much more relevance to me than a special and even larger photography show. My next example is a Japanese photographer, Daido Moriyama. Again, I mentioned we cover the world in my department, so he's a contemporary artist, and I've included a shot of the Japanese pavilion, so you might get a sense of the not traditional space. So it's very similar, in fact, to what will be our future home, what we've called meander galleries. So they are not rectangular, again, not clearly driven which way you need to orientate yourself through them. They'll be prefaced by mixed media work before and after. In this case, the Japanese pavilion, right before you enter this space, there's a spiral that leads down and you see scroll work, and right behind it is a ceramics gallery. So again, photography sort of being able to speak beyond its sort of ghettoized turf. He's known for his high contrast imagery, so that's not my bad slide doing all that. His color imagery up the top, I'm just making a reference to because he's a photographer who does not privilege the unique photographic image, does not edition his work. In fact, has been known to make sort of photocopies of his images and create books and distribute them for free. The color work, he sent us imagery and we reproduced it and used the opposing curved wall that you can see there, so hundreds of color images that we just put up on the wall with a magnet. So again, a much more democratic approach to photography than you see in other time periods. This next representation is Bauhaus. So we have modern galleries that are quite extensive, and there is very little photography throughout them. Again, why? So I made a repeated case to at least have a Bauhaus moment. So showing you, sometimes I get a small one, 3 images, and other times much larger. For those of you who know your Bauhaus figures, that hand photogram is Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, as is the image to your right, the bird's eye view. The next image is by Heinz Loh. The man playing the banjo is by T. Lux Feiniger. Back down on the bottom row, got Grit Colin Fisher. And the final image on the other side of the hand is Jordi Kepes. This last iteration is just a small representation of a much larger show I co-curated with a colleague of mine who works in the Works on Paper department. And we came up with this idea of the fairy tale. She has a focus on German expressionist studies. So what came up was a lot of German work. That's Caspar David Friedrich in the center, giving you this sort of touchstone for the whole idea. For those of you who know your art history, he's an iconic German romantic artist and is singularly known for putting the sublime in nature into play in art history. I thought of Edward Weston right away because he too would be somebody I would petition to put the sublime in nature. What we've got here, not a nature image, it's his work called MGM, so he's on the studios in the 20s. Those are dummies used for some purpose. Rose Mandel is on the other side. And that image is not of a fairy tale, but I love the fact that you can, once you start to displace photography outside of its own singular history, have it married with others, images come alive in a whole different way. So that was really just a street photographer shooting a storefront. That's an eye doctor, that's his calling card. But when you put it in this context, suddenly people start to read photography differently. And that's one of my goals, is to get people to stop and really try to read through a photographer's intent a little bit more. Next one. As Brian hinted, I have been doing some shows that also travel. The impetus for this show was really our construction that I hinted at. We are about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years behind. Not surprising. The idea was that we would start to put our collection out on the road in a much more serious manner. Normally when we put shows out, we propose them to sort of like-sized institutions, institutions that have photo departments as active as we are. And in fact, what we decided to do was the inverse, was to find a more localized group of partners, San Jose is the first to crop up, that maybe didn't have a strong photo collection, but had a photo audience, who, it normally would not take a show from us because it would be too large. So it was a really interesting exercise. As you can see, the show has traveled, and at one point came right into our own backyard in Pasadena, and the idea was that we were supposed to be shuttered. It was very confusing people. Why are you out there? And is indeed going to go now, strangely, very far afield. We have a partnership with the Hughes Museum in Shanghai. So that'll be its final end run. As Brian said, that title is one of my hallmarks, my claims to fame. I would be in meetings with certain staffers who were not familiar with this sub-collection, which is the Audrey and Sidney Ermis collection of sub-portraits. And I'd be talking about the show, and they'd just pause a minute and say, "Oh, like a selfie." Invariably to say, "This is not a selfie." And I started calling meetings, and the subject line was, "This is not a selfie." So it kept spiraling. So it's, curators are not known for their sexy titles. Witness my one from the beginning. We'd like to put a colon in there and think we've done our job, but that was my one claim to fame. So I'm going to walk through the show just a little bit. This is the power of PowerPoint. I'm just going to confess right away. Jennifer Moon, in reality, is about 6 feet tall. Miss Nadar is not, 4 inches. However, I consider them kindred spirits. And as much as Brian was mentioning, the self-portraiture show is sort of a mini history of photography. I also felt that the goal that I had was to bridge the historical and the contemporary. Contemporary gets to look like they're having all the fun, basically. And my point was, no, even early practitioners were messing with that concept of photographic truth. We think that historical photos are more truthful. There's no tricks being played, when in fact, it happens right from the beginning. So Nadar is rather disingenuously dressed as a quasi-Native American. He's French. It's 1863. Photography's been around for about 20 years. Oh, spoiler alert. He's one of those practitioners who has a commercial studio and invites all of his sitters to don different costumes. So already he's not asking them to be themselves. And we think of those early portraits, many of which are very staid and truthful, but many are not, as is his. He was rather an exhibitionist as well. He was known to sort of fly in a hot air balloon to promote his studio, very extravagant gestures, all the things that I don't think that we associate with a really early practitioner. So, Jennifer Moon, okay, now that you got the spoiler alert, you should really be able to guess this. What is that image? Does anybody know what that image is riffing off of? Yeah, I did it. You ruined it. So, actually, I just like how this image is so well known that eventually Huey P. Newton is getting his photograph taken in front of his photograph. Jeez, I'm not going to do that again. Jennifer Moon is an LA-based photographer who is a rising star right out of grad school at UCLA. Hit some speed bumps, being an addiction problem, was actually incarcerated. And this is her work coming out. And so she's trying to empower herself, sort of stare down the issues that she's fighting against. So thus the useful tools of the Black Panther movement. She's got her voice, literally, the karaoke microphone, the typewriter off to the side, her little dog, too. These images are 150 years apart, but to me they're kindred spirits. Okay? There's another through line through the show, a couple through lines beyond that very didactic history of photography that I really wanted to deploy when I was installing the show. One of them is ideas about masculinity, also gender. It's kind of a hot topic right now, so I decided not to make that one of my slides. Instead, the other topic is humor. Humor in photography. I'll describe some of these images as we're trying to decipher them right now. The first image to your right is Douglas Gordon. The title of his piece, I need to read it so I don't skip anybody. Myself as Kurt Cobain, as Andy Warhol, as Myra Lindy, as Marilyn Monroe. This is a headshot he created after receiving the Turner Prize. He's British. It's one of the esteemed prizes in the UK. He had no headshots, so he created this. His practice is really about a critique of the art world, what we value and what we don't value. So his references really bring to the fore the concepts of creativity and destruction. We willingly don't acknowledge failure as a part of that. Kurt Cobain is the rock star who, quote unquote, failed, even though he was a success. As he Andy Warhol is the idol that you can't top off of his pedestal. Myra Hindley, I'm not sure if everybody will recognize that name. She was a child murderer, big in the news at the time. So again, these concepts of criminal and destructive. Marilyn Monroe, a successful yet tragic sex idol. So that duality, which I mentioned humor, it's obviously dark humor I'm referring to. We put him in this category. But like a good joke, this image is a critique. So when we're laughing at a joke, it's because there's an inherent critique about society in there. We're laughing at ourselves. So he's in this category for that reason. Anne Collier is the next image, trying to find herself in the disco ball. It is a disco ball, that's not readable. And I find a disco ball to be just equally funny and tragic by itself. She's trying to find herself, and obviously it's an impossible task as you keep moving. You're only getting a tiny bit of yourself. You can never see the sum of yourself. And I kind of, when I look at that image, I start doing that same thing, moving around. So in my mind, she fits this category of humor because it is sort of the slapstick meets sublime. The triptych at the corner is by Martin Kurcels, who is rather a giant of a man, which is why he opted for a very vertical presentation, about 6'6". And this is entitled Tossing a Friend. This is his self-portrait. This is me. This is who I am. I'm that big. I can toss my friend. I put this in the humor category because my subtext title is, trust me, this is going to be funny. He started his career more in performance art, again, utilizing his girth, his presence on the streets. One example that can lead into this image is he would do sort of an improv on the street, mimicking some of those moments that are awkwardly embarrassing, and I'm not quite sure why, but sort of tripping, bumping into somebody, spilling a bag of groceries, and we're sort of shamed by that inadequacy. So he's translated that in many different ways with other performances, photography, documenting that. I also like to think of this as the toss as a hug, because there's a lot of trust involved here too. I'm now going to show you a few examples of works that have been added to the Irmis collection, which came into our museum in 1992, over 180 self-portraits, but have been added to over the years. So that's quite a few more portraits, self-portraits. And it became increasingly global. And that allowed me to think of this collection outside of the very narrow rubric of self-portraiture. So most of the stuff I deploy in the museum in different galleries. This is a unique situation. This is not a selfie tour where they're all together again as a family. Work you're looking at right now is Simran Gill. The first black and white image is what's on tour right now. It's actually part of a suite, so I've given you a little bit more of a taste. And she's a Malaysian artist whose practice is based on being a non-willing immigrant. She's had to leave her homeland, as has most of her family and all of her relatives over the years. The image at the top in color could be considered a self-portrait. It's an image of one of her extended family's home as it's literally disappearing. The indigenous population is, and their footprint is disappearing in Malaysia, as is the architecture that is from the area. The suite where she's imaged was created when she was on residency at the Texas-Mexico border. So again, this issue that is much more global diaspora than just her own immediate concern, plays out in the self-portrait. She had never heard the term native plants, so she is at the border, different sides, and in disguise as native. So I've included both of those these series in our Southeast Asian gallery in mixed media presentations. So again, photography living a little larger than what we've described in the past. Two more images. I think the Morimura is the one that people took the most selfies with. That's on your left. Yasumasu Morimura, who's a contemporary Japanese artist, as Frida Kahlo. Kind of assuming everybody knows her, she's an icon worldwide. This image is a little deceiving. It is a circular image, not a square image, and it actually projects about 10 inches off the wall, so it's got depth to it. That's sort of the beaten tin that you see in Mexico, and the fake flowers, the wonderful plastic flowers that will never die. He is working, his work is a critique of the Eastern world's almost too ready embrace of Western icons. He grew up right after World War II, quite an embrace of everything Western and discarding of their own history in many ways. But I have put this image more often than not in our Latin American galleries. It is really a poignant moment to think about Frida Kahlo translating into a Japanese specter. The gentleman right next door is Zhang Huang, a Chinese contemporary artist, who's also more of a performative artist. In this image, he asked all of his friends and associates to write something about himself on his body. You'll see one English speaking person who's written ABC on his left bicep. It's sort of his shout out to the East trying to communicate with the West. And I, of course, included this in our Chinese galleries amongst other calligraphic work across India. It's all about the written word. The next exhibit I'm going to show you is one that was also closer to home. Very sensitive. Mariana Yampolsky, who's a Mexican photographer. Pause a bit, because you're all going to say, no, that can't be. She is actually Chicago-born and chooses to emigrate to Mexico City. She does this in 1945, when she's 19 years old. It's quite an amazing story of border crossings. So she makes that choice. She is not stuck there because of the war. She becomes a Mexican citizen. She studies with Lola and Manuel Alvarez Bravo, and is considered one of the modern masters of Mexican photography. I was able to put this show in a museum that's part of the college campus, which was a first for me, and really thrilling because I get to talk about all the hard issues. I met with sociology classes in this space, I met with political science, and I talked a lot about how you consider, do we consider a white woman born in the States who chooses to live in Mexico a Mexican artist? And what are those issues? I padded the scene a little bit by including a Mexican-born photographer who came to the States and has based his practice on imaging the Latino community in East LA. His name is Rafael Cardenas. This was a smaller presentation, but it worked out perfect that I was able to also be a bit more nimble because I was not buried within my much larger institution where tossing out the idea of one more artist would be kind of immediately shot down. But they have similarities in their approach. An honoring of the culture is obviously there. Rafa is on the left, Mariana's on the right. So I loved how they crossed over time. Her work goes through to just into the 2000s. She's passed away now. Rafa is in the present. I like to think that their arc, again, Rafa's the color, their arc progresses from sort of a social realism into a much more minimal presentation. These are both by Mariana. A good example of the social realism is the image on the left. It's not staged, it's using available light, but she's telling a story that is beyond the story that might literally be happening, right? The image on the, sorry, you're right, is a much more minimal, reduced elements. Kind of a tone poem is what I think of. And she traverses back and forth between these two modes of representation. It's that willingness to sort of experiment that I appreciated, and I'm going to shift back to that experimental node that I hinted at. And the next few slides are going to be kind of like speed dating, so bear with me. I've packed a lot more on each slide, but I wanted to give you the full embrace of what I mean by experimental, which to some people just means abstraction, not so. And in each decade, what is considered experimental changes radically, obviously, right? So I've also done a sort of mishmash of time. So you've got contemporary work sitting next to earlier work. Here we go. A little bit different now. The image on left is Ellen Carey, 1990s. Assuming most people are photo savvy here and will recognize that that is a Polaroid. And she's just pulling to create her image, and just manipulating the chemicals that are inherent in a Polaroid. This is, I've tried to do things by scale, but there's no way I could quite show hers. It's about 8 feet tall, about 12 feet wide, very narrow, almost like a scroll. Beautiful image. The center image is a photograph by Sheila Pinkel in the 1970s. She actually is folding the paper and then relaxing the paper, right? Your wet room techniques. So that is literally the image that's been folded, but it is now a smooth image in person. We've got a beautiful suite of images we acquired about light. The top image is a little hard to read. It's what was known as a verifax. Anybody reference that? That's the very early fax machine. New technology for imaging. That's by Will Larson, also done in the 70s. That's it's sending both image and sound through the fax machine. So those lines represent the sound. The next image down below is fairly obviously an X-ray, but it's a very early one, done by Dr. Dane Tasker in the 1930s. So one of those scientists come photographers. This next image is talking about the breakdown of the singular image, which we think of as something we do now. The first image at the top is by Calvert Jones, and it's from 1846. So that's two salt prints, two paper negatives making one salt print. So already, 6 years after photography has been invented, the concept of the singular image is kind of blasted out of the water. He wanted a different image, and that's what it took to create that sort of bifurcated image. The one below is Robert Frank, 1955, from his Hoboken series. These are concurrent negatives. So he just looked at his roll of film and realized that he was telling a story that should be two images together. This is predating his shift to film work. Mieczysław Berman is in the center. That's an homage to Lindbergh. It was done in 1927. That's a montage, not a collage. Right? So collage existed for many years. The montage exists because you're taking all those disparate elements and you're actually photographing the final thing as one image. This is really feels very current to me because it's him talking about the sort of new era of time and space that came about when Lindbergh traveled as far as he did. You could say we're feeling all that now with the sort of the time zones, as I call them, that are the internet, just expanding. And the last image, that's rather perplexing, is 2017 image by Melanie Wilhite. Oh. Oh.
We can get back.
I'm not sure if I'm doing really bad, so I don't trust myself.
Here, I'll be glad to take it. That's okay. He's an ancient professor.
Yeah, professors are good. Oh.
Okay. This one.
Oh, there you go.
Beautiful.
Many spoiler alerts today. I'm gonna go back and try to get rid of them.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, Melanie, perplexing image at the end. Is a reference to the digital age. She's an LA artist. Long story short, body of work. Of course, since she's digital, she kept on a laptop that was stolen, eventually found, which is just crazy enough, and all of her files have been corrupted. And so there's a magical moment that we have in photography when something happens that you don't necessarily usher in and you embrace. So she got that sort of pixelated, repeating motif that is very much a disconnect of sort of a digital psychological space, is what I call that. So she started trying to create that anew. All of her work now is going forward from that one mistake. David Hockney, 1982, an image that to me references a bit the imagery on this right next to him, which is Doug Ricard, who's using Google imagery. It's that very different view of the world. So Hockney is depicting his hotel room in New York. It's the Sunday paper on the bed, and that's that pixelated version of his world, which to me feels very much like the seamed Google imagery that we all live and breathe and rely on now. Doug Ricard has found images of areas in the world. These two are specifically Sacramento and Los Angeles. He's gone to Baltimore. Areas that are stressed, impoverished, and also not imaged in the world. We have no sense of what their world is like. We're not traversing through it, and suddenly here's Google capturing South Central LA, the moment of a man watering the sidewalk. Just these very odd moments. He's moved on from that because he does not like how Google images are sharp and clear now, so that blur that you're seeing is his intent. One more for experimental. The top image is actually by an MIT professor who worked with the first computer that created an image. That is a program that he created, and he had the computer spit it out in 1963. The next image, which is again purposefully hard to read, is an image by Anne Collier, the disco ball queen. That's an aura camera capturing her aura and the accompanying computer printout. Again, these are different types of photography that live within our collection and are not what you would expect, I imagine. Especially so the next image, which I'll give you a moment to read it. It's actually a wallet opened up with that retro bifold of images, except they're not photographs. The detail up in the corner, I'll tell you a little bit more. It's an artist, David Bird, who's based up in Oakland, who riffs off of a lot of photographic tropes. And when we see an image that's in a scenario that we're supposed to understand, is the photo in your wallet, we read it as a photo. But these are actually just oil on mylar, so completely abstracted landscapes. We also have some slides he's made in the collection. Again, these are interesting things that I get to bring out when I want to talk about how much photography is embedded in our world. The image right below is Stephen Pippin, 1990s image, and he utilized a machine at the laundromat as his lens to make actually a self-portrait. You gotta focus on it, focus, you'll start to see it. So that's a really scratched up lens, what that is. He's a British artist, he was new to LA, and he found just life in a laundromat fascinating. So, portrait, picture of Marco Brewer is our other sort of golden colored image by my side. He is part of that wave that's almost like the pictorialist movement, fighting the digital domain and returning very much to a hand-applied analog practice. So he creates abstract imagery and burns, scratches, does just about anything to the surface to actually create his composition. He's, in fact, for this one, used a record player at one point, so there's a layer in it you can't see in this slide. My last project, will hopefully expand on this experimental idea. As I said, this, to me, traverses over time in our collection. And the show that I'm proposing to go on the road next is California. Whereas I've written all the terms that I found: Baja Norte, Califia, California, and Cali. Anybody can tell me where Cali, why Cali has come into prominence, I will reward you with something. I cannot find it. No Googling will tell me how this is suddenly the only word we can use to describe our state. So 3 images here, all in the collection. And I know there have been many shows about California, but the whole point that I was making for this show was this very experimental node that's part of our DNA. We are a very idiosyncratic collection. We might have 20,000 works, but I'm telling you that we do not have all the usual suspects, and that's what makes it unique. There are all those people involved from the very beginning, like Edward Weston, contributing. So we've got an image from 1931, Shinzako Izumi, that's the 2nd Street Tunnel in Los Angeles, Ansel Adams, Death Valley, and Anthony Lepore, local LA artist now, moved from the East Coast. These are all essentially about light, right? And I wanted to, again, have people stop and look at an Ansel Adams and get a little further than I feel like we've never been able to, or at least a certain generation. Anthony Lepore is a little harder to understand, just to get a little background. He came from the East Coast and fell in love with the wide open California landscape, started visiting parks, and realized the point of entry is a very mediated experience. Invariably, it was a photograph of the landscape you were about to visit. This is a photograph of a sunset at the little shuttle bus stop as he's about to go on a little sort of shuttle drive through this national park. Also about light. Here's another trio. Edward Weston again. Hope I'm keeping all the F-64 people happy. Is more where that came from. And I put these 3 together so you can also understand how I am out in the world looking at photography. These all came into the collection in 2008, and that wasn't random. Edward Weston, I'll sort of set the scene for this one first, came through the Vernon collection. Marjorie and Leonard Vernon, who, there's a shout out to Carmel, started their collection in the 1970s after a visit to Carmel and to the Weston Gallery here. They did not buy Weston first off, sorry to say, but their incredible collection of over 3,500 works now lives with us. So part of the story of my ability to be able to disperse photography throughout the art history timeline is because of the breadth and depth of their collection. I have multiple Talbots now that I can play with. William Henry Fox Talbot, the inventor of photography. I have Eastern European gads of it that I can throw into those modern galleries. But so the story I wanted to tell here, it's not just that wonderful moment of it staying in Los Angeles, was I fell in love with this image. It's one of only 2 duplicates of our Westons. We had a Weston collection, and then the Vernon collection came in. This is one of them. So I was familiar with it right away. And I wanted to build on that, not a landscape, not a still life premise that I think is in this work. So the next image is by Madoka Tagaki, 1990s. Japanese artist who moved to Los Angeles. That's one of those beautiful, ugly moments of Los Angeles where the alleyway is overgrown so beautifully with morning glory. She's printing on mulberry paper. That's the tone that you're getting. And I felt that that was really resonant with sort of art grayscale we see in a sort of more classic. The last image is Peter Holzhauer, who's a young LA artist. The date of his piece is 2008, so we acquired it in 2008. And I was very conscious of this through line, not knowing that I was going to do a California show, but the resonancies between each. As I said, not a landscape, not a still life, not hardscape, not only softscape. Yes, another Weston. This is a through line in the show that's about the utopia and the dystopia that is California, the land of natural disasters. This is Crescent Beach, which actually I'm not sure if I can place. And the other image is a contemporary artist from the Middle East, Amir Zaki, who is now teaching at UC Riverside, and part of that whole wonderful history of photography there, but clearly coming from another world. Two beautiful images. My second to last slide, in case you were wondering, is one artist, Sam Contis. She's a young artist who we acquired prior to her big debut in MoMA's new photography show. Just want to make that clear. This work is from 2013, and it is, again, a voyage of an East Coast artist who comes out to graduate school, San Francisco Art Institute, which many of you may know is one of the first fine art photography programs established by Ansel Adams and others. And she starts exploring the West, starting to drive as far as she can, finds a location called Deep Springs, which is both a location, as a school, and as a working ranch. And it's been in existence since the early 1900s. It's an all-boys school. They work the ranch. They do all the menial chores. They do the chores one doesn't necessarily associate with young men, teens, getting laundry. And it's kind of a study of masculinity in sort of this isolated specter. Obviously, the tough macho male lives large in the West, and yet here it's been in existence as a very gender fluid kind of scenario since 1900. It's also interesting for me because her work is always displayed as a suite, very different than the singular images we've been seeing. Different sizes, both color and black and white. And you might notice the smallest image to your right looks like an archival image because it is. So she's an artist who's rephotographing existing photography, mining the archive that is the existing story of Deep Springs, so the story. And I wanted to, especially to show that this suite, is one of my favorites, but it also brings to light that disparity between the value of a photograph. The archival photograph for Deep Springs has value for her in her artwork. So suddenly it exists in a different plane. And I realized that's happening repeatedly to me now. Photography is morphing so quickly. So my next slide, I'm going to show you a few images that are in the same family as that archival image that an artist included in her work. The top image is unidentified. It's an image created by Worldwide Photos. You know your photo history, that's basically an agency that was bought up by the AP, Associated Press. So all the imagery that they produce that gets used in the world is unidentified. I wanted to add this image to our collection because it references a very specific moment in LA history. That's Amy Semple McPherson, who came out in the 30s to create her own religion. That's what you did. Came out to California and you could do whatever you wanted. There's just not much imagery, official imagery, or artist-driven imagery of her. So I needed to go down this sort of black hole that we call vernacular. So that archival material that you saw Sam Contis using could be termed vernacular. It's unidentified, it's your personal snapshots that tell your own story. So I was having to find collectors, because there are collectors now who value vernacular photography as much as an Edward Weston print. But this is an 8x10 image, pretty beat up, has a different value. The next image is an Edward Weston. Very early, it's when he had his portrait studio in Tropico, aka Glendale, California. So he was photographing a lot of the bohemian culture. This is a painter, his name is Stanwood Badger. It's printing out paper. So many of you are, I know there's a lot of photographers here, so I won't go into the explanation deeply, but printing out paper doesn't involve a darkroom. It's the cheapest possible print you can make. So in Edward Weston's oeuvre, this would be kind of not such a great print, you're thinking. This is not him able to do everything that he's able to do photographically. And yet it exists as a wonderful image because it's within my institution. It's got that sort of legacy and the history. The next image is Hoyningen-Huene, and I'm bringing that one up. This won't be included in the California show, but it came up because it was a potential for the most recent show at the Getty called Icons of Style. And we had the curator looking at a lot of imagery, and I'll admit, I'm a little competitive. I wanted him to include this image. When we pulled it out, there was a loss of emulsion right at that horizon line. So just horribly in the center. I was like, oh. So I said, we're going to treat it. And we normally don't treat photographs. My role as a curator is to caretake the images, but their state that they come to me in, like the Worldwide Pictures image, is part of their history. It's like wiping off the patina, almost. So when I said, this time we're going to do it. It's a very tiny little bit of infill. If the photographer were alive, he'd be doing it. We're going through that process, and I'm researching a little bit more. Hoyningen-Huene shot this for Vogue magazine in 1930. So he, in fact, didn't own copyright. And I found myself on the Condé Nast website. And you can today buy this image for $100, a gelatin silver print. So again, the muddy water of what institutionally I give value to. Sorry, it's going to get even muddier. The next image is, hopefully most of you know this image. This is a variant of a key image. It's a portrait of Joan Didion, done by Julian Wasser, 1968. He was commissioned by Time magazine. I, for some reason, always thought it was her book cover portrait, because it's so well known. This is the one you know. Slouchy to Bethlehem had just come out. So this is the start of the LA woman. Shout out to Brian, who calls me that. Let's see. So the slippery slope in this scenario was that being a photographer for hire, he was never printing his images for the wall. He didn't have a vintage 1968 photograph to share with me. What he had was, amazingly, his vintage 68 contact sheets. So I got to look through. And so the compromise I struck was if I wasn't able to get a vintage image, which is physically impossible, but the artist is here, I worked with him and convinced him to print this image, an alternate, as our image. He wanted to print it, of course, like a poster size. Bang! Compromised him down to 16 by 20. So, again, a little muddy, right? Now I've got a not vintage, not the key image in our collection. And by stint of being in our collection, it now is speaking to other images and has a whole total different value. I just wanted to share some of that with you. The changing world of photography is not just about digital, it's also about actual prints. It's something I have to be conversant with. But I won't leave it there. I'm not going to leave it muddy. I'm going to end with this final image. which encapsulates so much of what I think I've been talking about. It's experimental, it's about photography, it's not a singular image. I'm letting you be able to figure out what you're looking at first as I keep describing this.
And it was seen in our gallery.
What's it?
And it was seen in our gallery.
No.
Yeah.
Wow, not this image, maybe
Not that
from the
particular.
series, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is Cleo McKenna, who's based in San Francisco. These are photograms of a tree. The title of the piece is called Born in 1824. She's a bit of a photographer, activist, in that she, her family is a family botanist, and she grew up deeply embedded in nature, found herself then living at the edge of nature, has a team of arborists who tell her when certain trees have disappeared. And so she has to stealthily go at night, because these are areas that are being developed, and take a rubbing. So that's 4 sheets to be able to create this image, which is about 40 by 50 inches. It's sublime, as I said, it's about photography. And I like to think of it as a sort of capper, a Zen moment. And I hope to leave you with that Zen moment.
Wow. Thank you.